Welcome back. If you're here, you're likely focused hard on the UPSC, aiming to really, build that solid base of knowledge.
Hmm.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into something critical, increasingly relevant for mains, maybe even prelims prep,
Absolutely.
the link between gender and climate change in India. And our discussion today, it leans heavily on recent reporting from The Hindu, which of course is a key resource for aspirants.
That's right. And it's interesting because while India has definitely made strides, on gender equality since the 95 Beijing Declaration.
Right, that global commitment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But how those gains actually interact with climate change challenges,
Yeah.
well, our sources suggest that's often underexplored.
Okay, so we see progress, things like laws against domestic violence, workplace harassment, those come to mind.
Hmm.
But what the Hindu seems to be showing is that this accelerating climate crisis, it's actually creating new vulnerabilities for women, maybe worsening old ones, especially in those really susceptible regions.
Precisely. And there was a really powerful example highlighted, I think it was a woman in Chhattisgarh,
Oh, yeah.
talking about how climate-driven migration is literally forcing girls out of school. It's a very stark reminder, isn't it? These big environmental shifts have such personal gendered impacts.
It really does show how they're not separate issues at all. Gender inequality, climate change, they're really tightly interwoven. The reporting emphasizes women often get hit hardest
Right.
because of things like, well, unequal access to resources, land credit, that sort of thing,
Yeah, the basics.
and less power in decision-making, plus that ongoing burden of care work, particularly in rural areas. Climate change just ramps up those existing problems.
It's like these climate stresses act as, well, you could call them threat multipliers.
Mhm.
They worsen inequalities that are already there.
That's multipliers. I like that.
So, for instance, when you have droughts or extreme heat leading to food shortages,
Mhm.
the sources point out women often face bigger health risks, things like anemia, malnutrition, even issues with reproductive health.
And that statistic connecting rising temperatures to domestic violence,
Yeah.
that's truly alarming.
It really is. An 8% increase in physical violence, over 7% in sexual violence.
Per degree Celsius rise.
Exactly. It's a severe consequence that we can't afford to ignore.
It really underlines that climate change isn't just environmental. It has these deep social security implications,
Mhm.
and they hit vulnerable groups hardest. But despite all this evidence, it's concerning, isn't it, that so few climate policies actually mention women specifically.
Around 6%, according to the sources we looked at, which is tiny.
Yeah, it points to a really significant gap in how we're thinking about policy.
It does. This lack of specific consideration is a major blind spot.
But this brings up a key question. Are women just passive victims here? Thankfully, the info we've got from the Hindu suggests, well, quite the opposite.
Absolutely not. We really need to shift that narrative.
Right.
Women aren't just victims. They are absolutely essential for finding solutions. The sources really emphasize the vital traditional knowledge many women hold.
Especially rural and indigenous women.
Exactly. Sustainable farming techniques, seed conservation, managing natural resources. This isn't just, old wives' tales. It's practical, hard-won expertise.
Generations of it.
Generations.
Hmm.
Like women in some regions cultivating specific drought-resistant crops. That holds valuable lessons for wider adaptation, surely.
That's a brilliant point. And you see the role of women's collectives across India, too, in disaster response, ensuring local food security, protecting ecosystems. It's huge, but often goes unnoticed.
It's quite the disconnect, isn't it? They're doing this vital work, possess this deep knowledge, but their experiences, their solutions, often just aren't properly integrated into the formal climate planning.
A real missed opportunity.
Definitely. We're potentially missing out on a key resource in this fight.
And the Hindu's reporting, it really calls this out. The critique of the Beijing Plus 30 India report for not having a strong enough climate lens, that was pretty direct.
It was. And it highlighted how specific priorities of, say, indigenous women, sometimes summed up as the 3 M's, Mahua, migration.
Livelihood, security, environmental distress.
Right. Those localized issues often get lost in broader or generalized policy talk. And the Beijing Declaration, just for context, was that UN conference setting global gender equality goals. These reports track India's progress.
So it seems we need a much more localized participatory approach, something that really considers the unique situations of different groups of women.
Exactly. Moving past one-size-fits-all is just fundamental for action that actually works.
Okay, so let's dig into these policy shortcomings highlighted in the Hindu a bit more. That small percentage of climate policies mentioning women globally and in India, that points to a systemic issue,
It
right?
really does. And if you look at where the focus often lies in climate plans, national or state level,
Yeah.
there's often this heavy emphasis on big infrastructure, tech solutions, renewables, sustainable transport, which are important, obviously.
Sure.
But they often don't really consider how these big projects will specifically affect women, or, crucially, how women could be empowered through them.
Right, not just affected by them, but empowered through them.
Exactly. And the Beijing India Report 2024, as the source noted, seems to reflect that this gap persists.
It feels like trying to fix a really complex problem using only half the toolkit. And this issue of climate budgeting not being gender sensitive, that sounds like a pretty basic flaw.
It is. What's really interesting, or maybe worrying, is the lack of systems to actually track if climate finance helps women.
No gender audits.
Largely no gender audits for climate budgets.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know the real impact. And the source pointed out this risk of instrumentalizing women.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, basically including them in projects just to tick a box, meet a quota for female participation,
Ah, okay.
without actually giving them real decision-making power or building their long-term skills or leadership. It can sometimes be a form of greenwashing.
So making it look good on paper, but not substantive change.
Precisely. The focus on women is more superficial than real empowerment.
So the money isn't necessarily going where it could have the best, most equitable impact for women facing climate change. And then there's the whole issue of just getting women's voices heard.
Yes, exactly. If you think about broader democratic participation, the fact that rural and tribal women are often shut out of the formal channels where climate decisions get made, that's a huge oversight
Especially since they're often the first responders in crises.
and hold so much indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
Yet they're frequently left out of local governance, disaster planning.
It really drives home the need, as the Hindu suggests, for these community-based platforms, places to actively promote women's leadership in climate governance.
Making sure their views are central, not an afterthought.
Yeah.
And we absolutely cannot ignore the intersection of climate change with women's health and safety. That's an area that's often, well, almost invisible in policy talks.
How so?
Well, think about climate-driven food insecurity. That can directly lead to higher rates of anemia in pregnant women, serious health risks.
Okay, right.
And then there's that documented link we mentioned between rising heat and more domestic and sexual violence. That's deeply concerning and needs urgent focus.
It's quite striking how these connected problems aren't tackled together more often in climate plans. It's like they're treated as separate issues.
When they clearly feed into each other. It does raise the question, why aren't public health concerns, gender-based violence issues routinely built into climate planning?
Seems logical they should be.
Our sources really argue for a more joined-up approach. Climate policies need to be developed working closely with health, safety, social welfare departments. That kind of cross-sector work is essential.
No, it's not just down to the government, is it? What about the private sector's role here?
Oh, absolutely critical. The private sector can really drive a more gender-fair climate response.
How?
Well, climate funds, green finance. They should actively prioritize businesses led by women, support inclusive tech development, foster female entrepreneurship in the green economy. That could create real momentum.
Makes sense. And it sounds like collaboration across the board is key.
Absolutely vital. Government, civil society, academia, international bodies. Everyone needs to work together.
Specific.
Share knowledge, build skills and capacity, and maybe most importantly, celebrate and amplify the success stories where women are already leading on climate adaptation and mitigation.
Okay. So for everyone listening, especially those focusing hard on UPSC prep, let's quickly recap the main takeaways from this deep dive, drawing heavily on the Hindu.
Okay. First, that undeniable link between gender and climate change in India, often ignored, but critical.
Right.
Second, the reality. Women are hit disproportionately hard by climate impacts.
Mm-hmm.
Third, and this is crucial, women are not just victims. They're vital agents of change with unique knowledge and solutions.
Definitely.
And finally, there are significant policy gaps. We need to consciously integrate a gender perspective into climate action.
And for UPSC prep, understanding these nuances, that really gives you an edge. It sharpens your analysis, improves essay writing, especially for topics like social justice, environment, development.
Absolutely. When you discuss climate change, bringing in this gender lens shows a much deeper, more complete understanding. You can really make your answers stand out.
So maybe a final thought to reflect on.
Yeah, perhaps consider this. How can putting a gender lens on climate action lead not just to fair outcomes, but actually more effective and sustainable ones overall?
That's a great question.
And thinking ahead, as potential future administrators, what specific role could you play in closing that gap between policy and the lived realities of women in climate-vulnerable areas?
Something to really mull over. Keep exploring related topics, analyze current events with this gender climate perspective. Think about how this might shape potential UPSC questions. That nuanced understanding is gold.
And to help you continue exploring, please do like this deep dive if you found it useful, subscribe for more discussions like this, and definitely leave a comment if you have more questions. Your feedback really helps us shape what we cover next.
Absolutely. And just a final reminder, our whole conversation today drew significantly from the excellent reporting and analysis in the Hindu, a vital resource for your ongoing UPSC journey. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing towards those goals. You can do this.